Yeah.
That might be a good thing for him. But I said he had to get them processed and that price had to be included. So he probably doesn't know how to figure out how much he needs and stuff, you know.
Well, you know, if
but
he
they're gonna
lambs
put the
year
barley-
round, he could do pretty well even at New
Yeah.
Holland, because the prices there all through the spring were really good. Hi, Gabby.
Yeah.
We're gabbing, Gabby.
Yeah.
And I paused the recording because we were just chatting.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Betsy Hodge and I work at the Cornell Cooperative Extension in St. Lawrence County. And Gabby Wormuth is working with me tonight. We put together the program for tonight. She works at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Jefferson County. So since we're doing things on Zoom, it makes it pretty easy to work together and not have to travel, or wear a mask or any of those kind of things. So we can't serve cookies, but there's other advantages. So we're glad you could join us tonight. We're going to talk about raising bottle lambs and kids. And we're going to talk about two phases of that. Like there's bottle lambs that you don't really want a lot of bottle lambs, but you have to raise some. And then there's bottle lambs that you raise on purpose because you are milking your goats or your sheep, or maybe you are on a program where you're trying to pasteurize the milk when you feed it or something to control diseases. So there's a couple of things going on. I'm going to ask you all to turn off your videos and to mute yourselves and to ask questions in your chat box. And Gabby will monitor the chat box while I'm talking, and then I will monitor the chat box for her while she's talking. And hold on just a minute. Just being sure this isn't somebody. Okay. I'll get started with my part of the presentation, which is what to do with those bottle lambs that you didn't intend to have. And this always takes a minute to get your PowerPoint going right after you. There's the little arrows. There we go. So my part is called Bottle Lambs and Kids. It's a good thing they're cute because sometimes they're a lot of work. So I need to just admit there's something blocking on my screen here. There we go. So why do we want to avoid bottle lambs and kids? For those of us that are trying to get the mothers to raise them, mostly because it's really time consuming getting them started. Usually if we have this type of bottle lambs and kids, it's because there was a problem. They got chilled, the mother wouldn't take them, something. So it's going to take a little fussing with them to get them going. And especially at the beginning, you're trying to get them onto the milk replacer, make sure they got some colostrum. Sometimes they're with the mother, but you're supplementing them, trying to get the mother going. Whatever it is, it takes a lot of time, and you can't skip it because they have to eat. Once they're drinking well on their own, it's not nearly as bad. However, it does involve making milk replacer. That means you're going to have this bag of powder and sitting around, and it can be kind of messy. So you want to think about where you're going to put it and where you're going to keep it in a place where you can wash up easily. And it's also an expense. If you were thinking this lamb was going to be raised on the mother, and now you have to feed it between the labor, the milk replacer, and the time, it's really can be an expense. So let's talk about why we have bottle lambs and kids. A lot of times I find that it isn't what you might be thinking. A lot of times it's because they got put with the wrong mother. And if it's the wrong mother, whether she thinks it's all in the mother's eye, right? You may think the lamb belongs to her, but if she doesn't think it belongs to her or the baby goat to the doe, they aren't going to take it. So we will talk about fostering, but it is sometimes a challenge if you have a lot of animals lambing at once or kidding at once. They sometimes get mixed up, or you have some that are grannies, which we'll talk about in a minute. Sometimes the mother just doesn't recognize the lamb as hers. She maybe had a lot of multiples, and one of them went off in the other direction, started trying to nurse on other sheep, and she lost track of it. Sometimes you just have too many lambing close together in the barn, And then suddenly you have a set of twins and a set of triplets, and suddenly you have one ewe with 4 and one with 1, or something like that, because they just got confused and it's hard to change their mind. Occasionally you have a mother that rejects her lambs. Sometimes that happens with a first-time mother. They're scared, they can't figure out what this is, where this little animal came from, or they're sore, or sometimes they act like they're mad. We had one that was like overly attentive, so every time the lambs tried to nurse, she'd turn around and start licking the lambs, so they had a hard time nursing. And those I was able to supplement and hold the ewe and get her to figure out what she was supposed to do. But you need to pay attention to all those kind of things. Occasionally the mother is sick or injured or dies. I have had a predator coyotes take a ewe, and miraculously the little lambs survived and were hiding under a log right next to where her body was. Sometimes the mother maybe is sick, or has a metabolic problem, or is injured. Her back legs are hurt or something. And occasionally we had a bad bout with listeria in our close-up ewes one year, and we had lambs and lost some mothers really quickly. So it can happen. You can be left with some bottle lambs. Sometimes they just have too many for their milk supply. Most ewes and does can easily raise 2, but sometimes you have one freshens with a blind quarter, where they have 3 lambs and goats, or maybe 4. And I have had some that could easily raise 3 or 4, but not all of them can. And you may find it's wise to pull one lamb and feed it yourself, or try to foster it onto another. There are granny ewes, and I think I've never had this happen with goats, but I believe this could happen with goats as well. That's where a ewe that's very close to lambing is all turned on, her hormones, and she starts taking all the lambs that were just born. And I've come to the barn, seen a ewe there with 3 lambs. She's feeding them and pushing them with her nose, and she's talking to them. And I look at her back end and I'm like, doesn't really look like you lambed. Then you got to go around and try to find the mother. And you're thinking, well, I'll just let her have them. She really wants them. And then when she has her own lambs, she may reject those. So she could end up with 5 of her own, or she may reject the 3 that now can't go back to their original mother. So watch out for grannies. It's usually the same ewe every year, so we learn to watch out for her. Sometimes it's wise to just get rid of these. Sometimes they're handy because you can foster onto them easier. And sometimes something happens to the lamb. It gets caught behind the feeder, and the mother, by the time you find it, the mother doesn't recognize it as hers, or it got chilled and you had to take it away to save it. So there's lots of reasons for having bottle lambs. We try to avoid them. Also bottle kids, at least in a commercial situation like meat goats and meat sheep. So this is what happens. Sometimes they get up in a box in your house. The one on the left was born in that snowstorm last May. I had to bring her and her brothers and another set of twins back to the barn in a sled, and she was chilled. So I had to bring her in and thaw her out, and neither of the mothers that lambed thought she was hers, or she belonged to them. So she's a bottle lamb. Her name is Tinkerbell. She's a little bit spoiled. And the one in the other box with the little coat on, he spent probably 5 days in my family room. And he went through some tough times, wouldn't drink, couldn't drink, didn't feel good, kept getting cold, was hot, cold. Eventually got him going. And but of course, by then his mother was, she had other lambs and she didn't even recognize him as hers. So he was mine. And he was in a pen with a lot of other lambs, so he believes he's a sheep at least. So how do we avoid getting bottle lambs in kids? We try to have a lot of space. So when you're inside, you need to have enough room so they aren't lambing on top of each other. It's especially bad. They seem to sort of lamb in spurts. When last year, 4 days before we thought we were going to start lambing, there were 11 lambs in the barn. And so we had a bunch of ewes lamb like all at once, and then nothing until they were supposed to lamb again. So we don't really know why that was. But that's when you run into trouble, when a whole lot of them lamb together at the same time and they just get their lambs mixed up. Or they get them mixed up and there's one lamb left over. When we land outside, I've never had lambs get mixed up because they usually go off and lamb under a bush or behind a log or over in the corner of the barn or over by the round bale. There just seems to be more space and they don't usually have problems. Watch out for obstacles. I mentioned the one behind the feeder. There's always places in the barn the lamb can manage to get stuck. Or we have some that they lay down at the back edge of the barn and they somehow fall out underneath the barn and end up behind the barn. I don't even know how they do it, but these things can happen. So you need to really look around closely when you're lambing and kidding, and also try to, get rid of some of those obstacles if you can. And you need to watch closely, like if you are putting your animals in pens or jugs, is what we call the pens we put newborn lambs in. And you're just assuming that this lamb is with this mother and these are with that one and these look like the other ones and these two look the same, so they go together. You can't really make those assumptions. I mean, it's a good place to start. You have to kind of put them in the pens and then pay close attention because sometimes they fool you. And if they aren't with the right mother, the mother will not take them and she could even hurt them. And then there's just preventive basics of having minerals and nutrition, everything right so the lambs are strong when they're born. And I'm going to try something. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. I have found a little video on my Facebook. I can find it on here. Oops. So I have to, I don't know if this is going to work or not. Let me try it. Oh, nope. Okay. I mean, I have a great video, and it's in my, I don't know if I can get to it is all. Now I lost my PowerPoint. Okay, hang on a minute. I got to open the PowerPoint again. I had a great video of when we let all the lambs out of the jug, and it's all the mothers finding them and the ones that they don't want. And okay, so let me just stop sharing a minute and then share again. I was afraid of that. I probably should have opened several versions of Chrome and then it might have worked okay. Let's see. I need the slideshow here, people. See, I'm just waiting for the little thing at the top to go away so I can get it into slideshow mode. Go back down here to avoiding lamps. Okay, come on, I want to do a slideshow. There we go. Okay. There we go. Sorry. Thought I had this great video. If I can find it later, I'll put it back up. So let's talk about fostering. Fostering is, trying to give a lamb to you and getting her to take it. A lamb that she doesn't believe is hers, whether you do or not. And I find it very challenging. Some people are really good at it. Some people are maybe more convincing than I am or something. But I have had instances where I've fostered a lamb on and the mother is feeding it, but she's not really mothering it. So in our case, the lambs are on pasture with their mothers. And if they don't have somebody actually mothering them, they don't really do that well out on the pasture. So even though she took the lamb, it might not do too well. So you need to think about that. Some ewes are really hard to convince. Some are a little easier. And a lot of it is timing. Like if you have two ewes or does that just kidded or lambed, and one of them's got one and one of them's got three, you can often just put one of the three in with the one and rub them together, and she's just in the mood to take lambs or kids and it'll work. But when it's not right at birth, it can be a real challenge. I'm going to show you some methods here. So first you can try to fool the ewe by skinning it. Like if you have a dead lamb, you can skid the dead lamb and put it over the new lamb and put it in with the mother. Sometimes you can fool her, or sometimes you can just coat it with the afterbirth. And there is something called vaginal stimulation down here on the bottom. If I can get the little pointer here. Here's the person they're reaching in as if they're untangling a lamb. And this ewe is just lambing, so they're stimulating her by putting their hand in her vagina. And then they're going to hand her another lamb. And the idea is, well, hopefully we've fooled her into thinking she had another lamb. And it actually works pretty good with goats. I have had luck doing that with goats. Mostly I was doing meat goats, but they were fairly easy to convince. You can also try to force the ewe or doe by putting them in a stanchion, like a little pen with a stanchion. And there's some examples over here on the right. Up here in the corner, you see this one has a little spot where the lamb can get away from the ewe so that she doesn't get stepped on. This one has a head stanchion and a spot where the lamb can get underneath. And you feed the ewe something to distract her. And here's a ewe in a stanchion. I think this is one from Premier, maybe, or maybe Seidel. And the lamb is in the pen, but the ewe can't really get her with her head, but she can. What happens to me when I try to do this is the ewe just jumps all around in the back end and steps all over the lamb. So it would only work with a lamb that's already pretty strong and knows how to nurse. I have better luck with them in the jug. Like sometimes you got a mother that likes two of her lambs, but the other one not so much, and I will hold under with one hand under her chin and back my back end around and push her up against the wall, and then reach down with my other hand and stick the lamb on and just kind of distract the ewe and let the lamb drink. I've also done that with goats. It's a little trickier because the udder's generally bigger, and hopefully if the kid is able to nurse off the doe easily, it can work. So after you hold them, you have to go in there 3-4 times a day and hold them. So it's not necessarily less work than feeding them, but you can sometimes get that to work after a while. They just get tired of you coming in and holding them, and they put up with it. So those are some of the ways I have seen people try to use hobbles. The stanchion is sort of the classic. Again, timing is important. Excuse me. So if you end up with a bottle lamb or kid, and I said or 10 because it seems like some years we have a whole bunch and some years we only have 1 or 2. And I have had years where I've had none, which is nice also. You need to remember they're babies. So they're just like people babies. They eat frequently, they sleep, they poop, they play a little bit, they like to get a little attention, and it repeats. So that means you're probably going to be carrying this lamb or baby goat around in a box or a clothes basket with you. Sometimes they go to the grocery store with me in the back of the car because I'm going on to work or something. Or you have a handy spot. If you have a nice pen in the barn where you can put them that's protected and clean, that's good too if it's somewhere you can get to during the day. And we mostly start them on the bottle. And I'm going to show you pictures of some good bottles and nipples to use as well. It's really important that they get some colostrum. Colostrum is that first milk out of the teats, and it's there for probably a day, day and a half, but it goes down in quality as you go over time. And so the first colostrum is really important. However, at least in the case of sheep, and also in goats, I've had this too when I've milked the goats by hand. It's very thick. Sometimes it's almost like milking out butter. It just sits in a glob in the bottom of the cup. And that's pretty hard to put into a bottle and feed to a lamb or a kid. So if you get as much as you can, usually if you keep milking, you'll get to some more liquidy stuff. And if you can't, you can mix up a little warm milk replacer, put that little bit of colostrum in there and stir it up, break it up good, and you can feed that and they'll at least get the colostrum into them. And that usually sort of makes them come to life. It's almost like you gave them a drug. It's kind of amazing. So don't forget the colostrum. Gabby's going to talk about amounts of colostrum and that sort of thing. But any colostrum is better than no colostrum. When our goats, last year we were smart and our goats freshened before our sheep, and I saved colostrum in little Ziploc bags in the freezer, and I could throw them into a bucket of warm water and then cut the corner off or just pour them into with a little funnel into a bottle. And the goat colostrum worked pretty good on lambs. It also worked good on baby goats when we needed it. So if you have a high producing, I've never gotten that much colostrum out of a sheep that I could freeze it, but I haven't tried that hard. if you have a good producer and you could even get, a couple ice cubes worth, it would be worth it to have, because that could save a lamb. If you have goats, usually there's a little more volume there, and you can, let the lambs drink or the kids drink, and then go back and milk out some colostrum and save a little bit for next year or for later in lambing or kidding. There is artificial colostrum, and it has really improved. There's even some milk replacers that have the colostrum in them. So read your labels carefully, but the artificial colostrums are better than nothing also. Those are usually available at the feed store, if you can find them. I tend not to use cow colostrum or cow's milk because of the potential of yonis. There is sheep yonis and goat yonis, but it's more common in dairy cows, and you don't want that in your flock. So these are babies, and they need, you can rub them all over with a towel when they're if they're still wet, or even between feedings, I scratch them on the chest or I tickle their butt, something that'll sometimes get them eating a little better. And some of them, if they've had a rough start, some of them take quite a while to get going, and you just have to keep fiddling with them and trying to convince them they're hungry and that they want to live. And some boy, they get a little bit of colostrum and they take off, and then you're it, because they think you're going to feed them, and you are going to feed them, but they figure that out. It's like they imprint on you. So let's talk about, now that you've got them off the bottle, which we usually do for a day or two, depending on how strong they are. Once they're able to drink out of the bottle easily, then we can get them onto a bigger feeder. So there's buckets. We're going to look at pictures of all of these, by the way. There's buckets with nipples towards the bottom, so that, as the milk goes down, it's easy, it all goes right to the nipples. There's buckets with the nipples that are near the top, and they have clear tubing that goes down into the milk. There's what we call a lamb bar or kid bar that has a whole row of nipples on the bottom. And there's automatic feeders as well. So let's take a look at some here. Well, here's one. This is a Premier, one actually only has 6 nipples on it, and I think there's 8 lambs there. So what's the problem here? Well, we need one more feeder, right? So that they aren't competing so hard. You will notice that this little lamb here, even though he's the littlest one, he's got the nipple in his mouth. So he's doing pretty well, but I don't think that's a great way to feed lambs. You really need another bucket. But you can see that they can, once you teach them how to drink off of there, which means you got to go in there, push them up to the feeder while they're pushing backwards, and open their mouth and stick it on the nipple till they figure out, because that nipple is not the same as the one we use on the bottle, so that they figure out how to actually suck on there. So here's some things to think about when you're getting a feeder. How easy is it to clean? Because it's really important that you clean it, and if it's difficult, nobody's going to want to do it. So does it come apart easily? Does it fit in the sink? And you'll see some of the pictures I show you. It's really hard to wash something if you can't get it in the sink. Now, when the weather's nice, you can use the hose outside, but if you're lambing in February, that doesn't work so well, at least not around here. And do you need certain things to clean it? Like, do you need a little brush to get in the nipples, or do you need a wrench to take things off, or what do you need to make it work? And how many lambs or kids are you feeding? If you're only feeding 1 or 2, you may just keep them right on the bottle. And I also try to think about, can I get the parts? Because there's almost no place locally that sells lamb nipples that would fit a feeder that you ordered in the mail. And there's almost no place that actually sells a lamb feeder, for that matter. And think about where it'll be used. Is it going to hang over a railing or like a pen? Or is it going to be mounted on the wall, or does it have a stand? How does that work, and how will it work in your situation? So let's look at some. This is called a Pritchard Teat, and I'm not promoting Dr. Pepper, except I really like their bottles. So when it gets to be lambing season, I always have to buy a 6-pack of Dr. Pepper and share it with everybody so I can have some clean bottles to use. And the Pritchard Teat is nice, especially nice for goats because it's long and thin, and it fits in a baby goat's mouth pretty easily, even a small one. And this little hole has a BB inside it. And so air, when you've got the bottle tipped up and they're sucking, air actually goes up into that little hole so that it doesn't make a vacuum in there. And the little BB keeps the milk from coming out. So that's called a Pritchard Teat. There are some other versions. I really like these. You can order them in the mail. I think our local feed store does carry them. And I have seen them at Tractor Supply as well. This is what we refer to at the extension farm as the mayonnaise jar feeder. So if you only have one lamb and you just want to have to clean one smaller thing, this will hold like a quart of milk replacer. And this is a more generic nipple, and it usually has a rubber band around here because they'll suck that right off of there. And it fits in this little wire holder. You can, it's kind of handy, you can hang it almost anywhere. Not very expensive. So if you just have one odd one, or you think you might only have one, or you need to supplement one, I sometimes use it as a supplement. That's pretty handy. And this is the Premier square bucket with those little nipple holders screw on to a piece that's on the inside of the bucket that has a little like straw that goes down into the milk right to the bottom of the bucket so that they can get it all out. And it has a cover, which I like. This one's hanging on the pen. And that's only a 2-holer. You can have 2, 4, or 6. And I wanted to talk about where you put your lamb feeder. This one is inside our creep feeder. That little thing that looks like jail there on the end. That's those are little rollers, and the lambs can squeeze through there, but the sheep can't. So only the lambs can get in there. It's called a creep feeder, and we give them grain in there. You can't see them; they're off to the right there with their heads in the grain feeder. But we put our milk feeder here and hung it up because I had it hanging over on this side, over on that side of the pen. But there was a ewe that every night would lay down there, and she'd rub up against the thing, and then when she stood up, it would catch in her wool, and she'd either flip it off the handle, she'd flip it sideways, she'd get it all dirty. It just wasn't working. I couldn't seem to convince her to lay somewhere else, so I actually put that in the creep feeder. You can, some other things you have to watch it. Some people's cats come in and chew the ends off the nipple. I've never had that happen. I shouldn't even say that out loud probably, but don't normally have that happen. Occasionally you get a lamb that doesn't need milk replacer that figures out that there's a little treat in there and they'll be a little pig. Most of the time they don't like milk replacer if they're getting mom's milk, but you never know. And I've never really had trouble with the ewes drinking off it, but sometimes that can happen as well. So if you've got a little pen where they can get in and out, or if your bottle lambs are just in a separate pen, that works well. There's Tinkerbell again. I just put this in to show that there's another type of nipple. You see this? These, oops, let me go one more here. These are latex rubber, and this is a red rubber nipple, and it's a little bit tougher because when they get bigger and they're sucking on that thing, they're really hard on it. So here's some other kinds. I haven't used these, but I have seen them in use. So this looks really handy if you had a bunch of animals, but you couldn't carry it if it was full of milk. So you must have to use it and then take it away when it's empty and wash it and then bring it back and hang it up again and then bring the milk to it in a bucket or something, because it has enough spots for 10, which is nice if you've got a lot of them, like if you have a goat dairy and you're trying to feed them. It does not have a cover, which I don't like to see because flies get in there and things. The other problem I see with this is, will it fit in your sink to wash it? It might if you have one of those big dairy sinks, you know, the long half-rounded stainless steel dairy sinks might work. Or if you have a sink with a little hose on the faucet so you could wash out in there. But you can always put soapy water in there and squirt it through the nipples. You don't really have to take the nipples off every time. And then rinse it, put clean water in, squirt that through each nipple, dump it out, clean the outside, dry the outside. I usually try to dry them so they stay clean. So this could be useful if in the right situation. And here's a slightly smaller version that hooks over the edge of a gate or something. And here's a one lamb version of this as well. I just found these online by Googling lamb milk replacer feeders, by the way. And there's different companies that carry them. I didn't put the companies underneath there. I've used this white one with baby dairy goats. So there's little black nipples sticking out in each of these places. It's a little hard to see with this background. There's one you can see. And they just fit in a hole in the bucket. And then there's a clear tube that goes down into the bottom of the bucket. And it's in this nice metal stand, and it sits right on the ground. So I can pour the milk in there, put the cover on, and the baby goats, sometimes I prime the nipples at the beginning so they learn that that's where the milk is. And they'll go right to town. I don't have much trouble with them knocking it over. If there's only one, it might be a problem, but usually it works out okay. And it's not too bad to clean. You can take those off pretty easily, or just run, squirt some soapy water through them, because that bucket lifts right out of that metal frame. And it's not actually a very big bucket. So these are some others I found online. You can get these from Premier. At least you don't have to stand there and hold the bottle. I just don't like washing the bottles, and because to get them really clean, you really need to use a bottle brush and do a good job. But if you only have a couple and it's fun, if you've got kids, they might really enjoy this. I know our kids at the extension farm that stop in and come to the after school program, even in the little holders, they'll stand there and hold the bottle and they get a big kick out of it. And this one, I'm not sure, that looks like a lot of work to me. It's cute and it's clever, but it's a lot of bottles. And this one looks like it could get a lot of dirt inside it into the milk. And then I don't know how you clean it if this piece comes off. It is individual, so if you were watching them drink, you might be able to see how much each one is drinking, although I'm guessing they move around some. But you wouldn't want to leave this sitting out like this, because I know in our case, they run by and they kick stuff up into the feeders and things, so it would be dirty. And this one, I thought this was pretty clever, actually. Somebody made little dividers, because if you've ever watched them drink, first of all, they have a favorite nipple that they all want to nurse on, and then they also do the thing like they do at the feeder, where they keep moving down thinking there's something better in the next one. So this was, I don't know how many that is, but it's sort of like that red feeder we looked at a minute ago, but they made dividers so that the lambs or kids could only drink off that spot. So let's talk a little bit about milk replacer. Gabby will talk some more about milk replacer in a couple minutes. If you're feeding lambs, it really should be sheep milk replacer. If you're feeding goats, it really should be goat milk replacer. And in the case of sheep milk replacer, it needs to be at least 25% protein and 30% fat. That's what it says in the literature that I looked up, but I will tell you that none of the milk replacers I looked at actually have 25% protein, but they all have 30% fat. So apparently sheep need a higher fat to protein ratio than some of the other species, and sheep, of course, can have copper. So you need to be a little careful. You can't really you can feed goat's milk to sheep, but you can't feed goat milk replacer. Should be high quality. Like when you mix it up in the bowl and you pour the milk out, you shouldn't have like nuts and bolts in the bottom or too many insect parts and that kind of thing. You want something clean. These are babies you're feeding. And some of them have preservatives. They're either acidified, the whole thing is acidified, or they have a little bit of preservative in the fat, because that's what spoils. It does go rancid if you don't store it in a cool, dry place. And it should be easy mixing. And lately, all the milk replacers I've tried have been easy mixing. They used to be horrible. It was like mixing up globs of butter and white powder and flour and water, and it was terrible. But now they seem to have gotten the method down, and they're really great. So, but it is an important thing for the person making the milk replacer. And I mentioned colostrum before. I want to make sure they get some colostrum. And you can buy artificial colostrum. Some of the milk replacers do have the colostrum right in them. So what about goat's milk or cow's milk? I've tried to raise lambs on cow's milk. It's okay once they're a little bigger, or sometimes you can make up for the lack of denseness of the cow's milk by feeding more of it. Same with goat's milk. We've often just milked our goats and we don't drink the milk, so we can't drink the milk. So we pour it into our lamb feeders, and they just drink so much they look like little barrels with legs all morning till they deflate a little. And so they're getting plenty of nutrients, even though it's not very dense. It does make for a very wet pen, because then they do pee out all that extra water. So I would say goat's milk would be better than cow's milk. And of course, sheep milk is the best, and sheep milk replacer is probably the next best for sheep. For goats, you can feed goat's milk. Like if you have a goat dairy, you may want to try to pasteurize it first if you're trying to get rid of different diseases. But certainly if you can afford to spare the goat's milk, they'll do well on that. Let's take a quick look at our lamb milk replacer. This is the one we're feeding at the moment. We just happen to have a few bottle lambs. We had some oopsie lambs born over Valentine's Day weekend when it was really cold, like -19, and they needed a little help. And I ended up with a few bottle lambs, mostly our fault, I would say. So this is called Save a Lamb. We'll look at two different ones that I have here. So this is what it looks like on the back, and I must say they really improved their writing on the back of the milk replacer bags, because it used to say, it was very industrial, 5 pounds of milk replacer for this much milk at this temperature, and it didn't really give you any hint of what the little cup inside the bag was, how much that weighed, or how to use it. So this has a lot better instructions, and it also mentions that they should receive colostrum before they get milk replacer, preferably early on. So they've obviously taken a little time to write some better instructions. But if you look at the analysis, let's see here, it's 23% protein and 30% fat. So it is a little lower in protein than what I saw recommended, but they all seem to be about in that level. And it has whey protein concentrate, dried whey products, dried skim milk. Whey is a byproduct of cheese, right, from real milk. So that's all real animal protein products. Animal fat, which is preserved, and lecithin, which is helps the fat go into solution, emulsifier, and a little dextrose, which is sweet, and then it's got all kinds of vitamins, minerals, and that sort of thing, all balanced for you, which is great. And it does mention you should store it in a cool, dry place, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. And I'm gonna, let's see, here's the instructions. So it tells you, basically they max out at around 2 cups of milk replacer and 4 cups of water. And what we do at the extension farm, we have 2 bottle lambs, so we mix 4 cups of replacer with 4 cups of hot water. We mix it up good, and then we add 4 cups of cold water, or cool water at least. And it's good for the day. And we put that in one of those feeders. If they drink it all in the morning, they don't get any more till the next morning. You can divide it up and feed it twice a day. That's okay, but this is really easy. And they do show here that basically the ratio is 1 part powder to 2 parts water by volume. And almost all the milk replacers fall in that, right in that range. So the little cup in there, you can use, the cup is supposed to weigh 4 ounces. And I really wanted to weigh some. I had to go out of town just before the program, and I didn't get to put the cup on the scale to show that it weighs 4 ounces, but I'm going to check it out tomorrow when I get to work and see how close it is. And I think the important thing is that you're consistent. So you expect a lamb, if you look down here, so the total they're going to eat during the day is 3 to 4 cups of milk replacer. And we sort of get ours right up to 4 cups per day. And that's 4 cups of mixed milk replacer, by the way. So 2 cups of powder or 4 cups of water. That goes into 4 cups of water. And we don't go up and down this much. We just give them that the whole time. And we sort of hope they start eating grain. We don't sort of hope, we watch them and make sure they eat grain. And it mentions down here, provide fresh, clean water at all times. So you got to have a little bucket in there, right, for them. So they usually watch the mothers and learn to drink. But if you have true bottle babies and they're not with other sheep, you might want to get them so they learn to drink out of a bucket. And then a good quality grain, and also your best hay usually, because they aren't really ruminants yet. So they really need to be on a grain and milk replacer diet, but as their rumen develops, you want them to have high quality feed. So here's a few hints. Use the scoop that comes with the replacer. It's 2 to 1, so technically you could use anything as long as you kept the ratio right. Try to be consistent. Some people always have their finger in the cup while they're measuring it out. Some people don't. You can use a whisk. If you only have a few, a whisk works good. If you're making big batches, sometimes you can get like a big whisk that goes on your drill. Saves a lot of wear and tear on your wrist. You do need to remember to charge the drill batteries. Unfortunately, I speak from experience there. You try not to incorporate too much air. Like I like to get it really mixed well, but if you get a whole lot of air in there, that sometimes is hard on the baby's stomach. I just figure most of the time, by the time I pour it in the feeder, do a few other things and carry it out there, a lot of that air has come out. But I have seen, sometimes they do bloat, so we try not to get any extra air in there. We always start with the warm water to mix it and then add cold. The next replacer I'm going to show you actually says to mix with cold water. I wouldn't feed cold milk replacer to a brand new lamb that you're trying to get onto milk replacer, but certainly after they're going, they don't really even seem to mind. They sometimes drink a whole lot and then shiver a little bit, and they just keep going. So If it's -20 out, I'm not sure I would feed them cold milk replacer, but if it's reasonable temperature, it certainly lasts longer if you put it out there cold. I mean, in terms of it doesn't spoil, not in terms of they won't eat it. If you're making big amounts, I mentioned you might want to do it by weight or use bigger cups. I know when we had a whole lot of lambs, and I was measuring like 24 cups of milk replacer and then 48 cups of water. It gets really hard because if somebody talks to you for a minute and you lose count, you're in a mess. So when we're doing a lot of them, we use a bigger measurement. Calf bottles work pretty good because they hold 2 quarts or something. We used to use those to measure as well. And some of the bowls have measuring on them as well. Here's another milk replacer called NutriStart. I've used this too. Again, 23% protein, 30% fat. This one has all animal protein. It does have a little vegetable fat. As long as it's below a certain amount, it shouldn't bother them too much, and it's kept fresh. Otherwise, it's pretty similar. It has the same sort of mixing instructions. Not quite as easy for somebody mixing up for a couple because it says 2 pounds of powder per gallon of water. And you might be only wanting to mix a pint. Here it says 4 ounces by weight of powder with 1 pint of water. 4 ounces of powder with 1 pint of water. But it doesn't tell you that the cup inside there weighs 4 ounces. And so that's a little deceiving or a little confusing when you're trying to figure this out in the barn. So some other things I mentioned, they should have water available. Should try to start them on a really good sheep lamb grain, or in the case of goats, and a goat grain would have the right minerals for them. Usually you go for like a high energy 16% or something like that. Could be a pellet, could be a mash. We start it in the creep feeder, or if they go to weaning without grain, which they do when they're out on pasture, we then start them very slowly on the grain. But if you can get your bottle lambs onto grain early, you can actually wean them early. We'll talk about that in a minute. Should try to put similar size lambs together. So we lamb some in February. When we lamb in April, we won't want to be putting those little bottle lambs in with the big bottle lambs because they won't get much to eat with the big bottle lambs in there. So we'll have to have 2 pens if that happens. Actually, by then we should be able to wean our February lambs. But anyways, you wouldn't want to mix too many different sizes together. And sometimes that happens when you get some triplets and they're relatively small with some big ones. So, just pay attention and watch when they're eating and be sure they're all getting to eat. So when you get towards the end and you're going to wean the lambs or the kids, you want to either use up the milk replacer or you need to keep it in the fridge or freezer. So if I usually save a little at the end, so I have it at the beginning of the next lambing season if I need it, or if there's some of those surprise lambs in February. And if it's in plastic, it's great. I roll the bag up real tight, tape it shut, put it in the bottom of my barn fridge. If we can fit it in the freezer, that's even better. So keep it cold and out of the light, and it'll keep really well, actually. And it's not as nice as fresh, but when you're got a lamb born late at night and you can't get to the feed store, or they don't have lamb milk replacer yet that time of year, it's nice to have that little bit of milk replacer. And I even sometimes put some in a plastic container and put it in my freezer just so I have it handy. Everybody's always looking through the freezer wondering what the heck it is, but there are some lamb kid problems you can run into when you're feeding bottle lambs. Occasionally you have one that bloats, usually more than once if they have that tendency. A little Mylanta in the drench gun or a little drench syringe or a little simethicone right in their milk will help. Got to kind of pat their sides and just like a regular baby and get them to burp it out. What happens is they get foam in there and then it's not easy to burp out. And if they get too bloated, it'll put too much pressure on their lungs and they won't be able to breathe. So it's important to get the bloat out of there. Those are not labeled for lambs, by the way. So you didn't hear it from me, but both of those things will work. They both have simethicone. Sometimes you have a lamb that just won't suck, or they'll drink, and then they just seem to go downhill. And it's probably true that it doesn't feel good, or even though it seems like it's okay, it probably doesn't feel good, or it might even be slightly chilled because they can feel warm, but if you stick your finger in their mouth, you can tell if they're really warm. Feel their feet, they should feel warm. So sometimes you need to warm them up a little. That one that I had in the box, I finally treated that one. I talked to the vet and she suggested I give her a little antibiotics for a couple of days, and that did the trick. Seemed to be maybe he really wasn't feeling that well, even though he looked okay. And actually his temperature was cold and then warm and then cold, so he was having a hard time getting started. Sometimes you can just try a different nipple or a different temperature of the milk replacer or a little different routine to get them to drink. And you normally have to put the nipple in their mouth, open their mouth, slide the nipple in, and sort of hold your hand under their chin to support their head. Like once they get going, you can just wave the nipple in their direction usually, and they'll grab on. But at the beginning, you need to help them out. I put tickle their butts. If you notice a mother ewe nursing her baby, she keeps like licking their rear end or pushing them with her nose. So helps sometimes if you can do that. Sometimes just rubbing them all over kind of gets them stimulated and they start looking for something to eat. When I say feed them under something, I had one lamb that would only drink at the feeder if my hand was above her head. I don't know if that's because it was more like reaching under the mother. Sometimes I do it with like between my knees, bending over, feeding the lamb sort of behind my knees. That seems to just, whatever you can do to get them started. And sometimes you just have to keep fooling around. So where are you going to keep your bottle lambs and kids? You're going to keep them, like on the left here, these are out in the barn. There's sheep on the other side. They kind of learn to be sheep while they're out there, even though they're sort of attached to you. And that's good if you want to keep these or sell them to people for breeding animals. You want them to know how to act like sheep or goats. Those are hair sheep, by the way. That's why they kind of look like goats or sheep. This kind of thing can happen, so you need to keep an eye on them. That's probably Tinkerbell. And they can get upside down in something. And I put that in there because I've seen people with a 5-gallon pail, a tall, thin 5-gallon pail, in with their lambs because maybe there's other sheep in there drinking out of it. Well, a lamb can get in there and can't get out and can drown. So we recommend using either the wider water pail, would think it was sort of a classic water pail because they can climb out of those easier, or a small bucket. And once they get in something like this, they can't get out, although they can make a lot of noise so that you come and get them out. And you can also keep them in other places, like a dog kennel. We used to have 2 lambs, and they'd be in here. And when my kids were little, they'd let them out, run around the yard with them. That's great, except that they think they're people when you're done. So if you can keep them in the barn, that's better. But it certainly is fun to have them, in your backyard or someplace handy. So let's talk about weaning. Now you're done feeding them. Let's talk about weaning. So traditionally, we feed them for about 8 weeks. They're usually eating grain then easily and drinking water. It is a long time. You really don't have to feed them that long. You can wean them. I saw 2 different studies. One was 24 days, one was 28 days. And both cases, they had a very high quality grain. And you can actually get that grain recipe from the Cornell website if you go down under management and click on feeding. So they're actually under there. And they need to be drinking water. So if you could stop feeding them at 4 weeks, that's like half as much milk replacer and half as much time. So I imagine if you had a big situation where you're feeding a lot of them, it would certainly make sense to try to wean them early. And that's what they do at Cornell. They're milking their sheep and they feed the lambs and then they wean them at 28 days. So how do you wean them? Do you just take the stuff away? Do you decrease the amount slowly? Well, if you decrease the amounts, the big lambs are going to just hog it all. So that doesn't always work. You can dilute it out or just put water in the feeder. We generally, since we usually feed them till they're 8 weeks old, we usually just take it away, and they're a little mad for a day or two, but they already know how to drink and eat, and pretty soon they're just eating the grain, and they might blat at you when you come in the barn, but they don't really seem to be suffering much. And just there was a nice budget Dr. Tony at Cornell shared with us for weaning at 28 days. So this is a lamb or kid that was born at, say, 7 to 10 pounds and put on 18 pounds over the first 28 days. So pretty good rate of gain, over half a pound a day. They were feeding milk replacer. It did not give the cost of the bag milk replacer, but it said it took $2 to $3 worth of milk replacer per pound of gain up to weaning. And then they fed them up to 100 pounds, and that took another 200 and some pounds of grain, and they used the price $3.20 a ton. So it was $139 total. And so if you could sell a 100-pound lamb, if you can get more than, $1.30 or $1.40 per pound, you should come out ahead, even though you had to feed the lamb at the beginning. Now, if you had to add on more costs for milk replacer, that's going to up that total cost. And you may or may not want to, some people like to sell their bottle lambs to somebody else to raise or give them away because they don't like to take care of them, but it can be profitable if you approach it correctly. And if that's your goal. I mean, at the Extension Farm, we enjoy the bottle lambs, and the students that come enjoy them because they're friendly. And so we don't mind having them around. We have probably more help than most people. Well, we have a lot of help during the week when there's schools in session, but we don't have a lot on the weekend or whenever schools break. But we don't mind feeding them a little longer, and it does cost a little more, but there are other benefits. So in conclusion, if you have bottle lambs and kids, it does take patience to get them started. Sometimes you feel like you just can't get them going, but usually if you're persistent, you'll be successful. And you won't save all of them, I should say. I say you can save them all, but you can't really always save them. Sometimes something's wrong with them on the inside or something. Use a system that works for you. If you have one or two and you want to baby them, that's great. If you have a lot of them and you want to decrease your labor, there's ways to do that too. Find a really good quality grain or creep feed. We have ours custom made at White and Patterson in Canton. Other companies will make you a custom mix. You can also buy some pretty nicely formulated lamb grains and also goat grains. And when you put the feeder in and you're feeding them, really you should watch them because you can see a lot about how vigorously they drink, how they feel after they drink, if they drink. So I always say don't put the feeder in and walk away. Put the feeder in and pay attention for a little while. It's kind of fun to watch them anyways. And then once you have these lambs and they're grown up, do you sell them or do you add them to your flock? Well, we had a really spoiled hair lamb at the Extension Farm. The BOCES students took her in the classroom and she got to sleep in the beanbag chair when she was little. And I was really worried that she wouldn't know she was a sheep. And she had twins this spring and she took just fine care of them. So luckily those instincts usually kick in. It doesn't seem to affect their ability to care for their own young. They can be a nuisance if they're too friendly and you're trying to herd the flock around, like doing rotational grazing, and they keep standing in the way or deciding they want to go back to the barn and visit with people, or they want to knock your screen door down and come on in the kitchen while you're making dinner. So you have to decide, what works in your situation. But we generally sell, like if we have a bunch of bottle lambs, we'll sell them to somebody starting a flock because then they have a group of friendly sheep to start with. I think that's all what I have. I'm going to stop the sharing here so I can see the chat. We have questions? I kind of like to find that video to show you of the ewes. See if I can find it now that we're off here.
And if anyone has any questions for Betsy now, you can unmute yourselves too and ask. But if not, we can wait until the end of my presentation to go and ask.
Okay, let me come back. I'm just gonna show you this. I think I can share it now. I know I couldn't do this before, but okay, I have to see if the video works for you guys. Oops. So these were lambs that we just let out of the jug. And see the mothers looking for their lambs. Whoops, that one does not like that lamb. And they do find each other by calling. They're kind of looking all over to find their lambs. So those are obviously not newborns, but I just thought it was interesting to see how they sniff the lambs and look at them and talk to them. They can be pretty noisy. And pretty entertaining. Okay, there you go. There was actually another thing on here, if I can get it. Oops, darn. Oh, well, let me get to it. I had pulled up the premiere page to show as well. Okay, a question. I see there's a question about feeding grain.
Yes, hi, thank you.
There you
I
are.
started my video. Yeah, here I am. I was eating dinner and I didn't think anybody needed to see that. So thank you for this presentation. I have a bunch of bottle lambs. I usually do because I raise fin sheep and get a lot of multiples. And my practice is to leave them with the dams and to supplement as needed. Sometimes some in the larger litters will do like half and half and, nursing and supplementation. Some will just get trained to come to the bottle and just come to me, but they still stay in their family group.
I've done that too. That can work really well, actually.
Yeah,
because sometimes they'll actually get strong enough so they can get enough milk off the mother too.
Or they
Sometimes
start
you can
stealing
get them
from
going.
somebody else too.
That too.
That happens too. But I don't feed grain except during gestation and lactation.
Yep.
And then once the lambs, so I lamb in March, so I just finished, and we'll go out on pasture probably the first week in May, which is generally when I stop feeding everybody. And I don't feed lambs grain in a creep feeder, and I'm wondering if that's a problem. You're stressing to you can wean early. I'm always wondering when is the right time to wean, because they would nurse forever and drink bottles forever if I would let them.
Okay, so you're on a pasture system though, which is a little different. When we lamb in April and go into pasture, there's no creep feeder for the lambs. But the ones, if I bring in bottle lambs and I'm feeding them inside, then I would definitely make sure they had grain.
So, and not just hay. I mean, they're in a paddock now. They won't be on pasture for another month. So you're saying once the lambs, they have access to hay, second cut hay all the time. And then when they go on pasture, obviously they have access to grass all the time. It's
Right.
okay for them not to have grain at all?
Most of them are getting some kind of milk, right? Either from the mother or from your bottle.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's
I'm
okay.
bottle feeding 4 times a day. So.
You won't be able to, you probably wouldn't be able to get them to eat grain. I've tried to do creep feeding on pasture, and some of them will take to it, like when the ewes all come in and lay down, if they're in that situation where they can get back to the barn to lay down out of the sun or something, the lambs will sometimes use the creep feeder, but not really.
Is it okay for until they go on pasture not to offer them grain for the bottle lambs?
Yeah, they just won't maybe not grow as fast. But if they're only a few weeks old, they're not going to eat much grain anyways. I mean, it's more a
Okay.
matter of getting them started on the grain so that when you do want to wean them, they're eating.
Okay, yeah, and they steal out of their mother's dishes, but I just
Well, that works too.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I see a question here about joint ill. And that might just be, she's saying they never have trouble with ewe-raised lambs, but always seem to get a couple or a few suffering from joint ill on bottle-raised lambs. That's something that enters through the umbilical, so I don't know if it's, it doesn't even have to really be what I would call dirty, just it's a bacteria, so they could have picked it up anywhere, and they maybe weren't cleaned as well as babies because they were rejected or
Yeah, I was thinking like
it up.
if maybe they're adding, if you're not already doing it already, dipping navels with iodine.
The problem is that if they're like me, I find a lot of them already dry.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it sounds good to go and be like, yeah, it's a good protocol. I'm going to go and do it. But sometimes it's just not always practical.
Right. And it might be where they're housed, or, if you got them all in a pen. And bottle lambs tend to be wet because they drink a lot and then they pee a lot, as are the pens where you have lactating ewes. So I guess the best thing is, as clean as possible. As Gabby said, dip the navels if you can. You don't really know which ones are going to be bottle lambs till they're bottle lambs, but and really watch for it so you can treat it before it gets bad, because it is hard to get rid of once you get it. I'm just looking here. Oh, looks like the whole 4-H group is there. Good. Anybody else have questions? This wasn't really a talk on lambing and kidding, but it had a lot of lambing and kidding things in it. We do have somewhere I have my video posted actually on lambing and kidding. If anybody needs that, I'd have to go find the link, but if you email me, I could send it to you. Okay.
I do
Go
have
ahead.
one more question, if I could, about mastitis. I've had a couple of ewes turn up with mastitis unexpectedly, which then causes more bottle lambs, and I tend
Yeah.
not to rebreed if they've lost, one or both teats to mastitis. And I'm just wondering, my barn is clean before lambing. They're on hay bedding. And I'm just wondering if it's something that's hereditary, or if there's something that I'm doing, or is it more of a product of you that has multiple births? But it definitely seems to be a cycle.
Are you getting like the purple gangrene mastitis?
I haven't had gangrene. A couple of them, I don't even realize until they lamb that maybe one of the teats is not functioning,
Not
or
working.
one half of the, yeah. And I did have one ewe this year that got engorged almost 2 weeks before she lambed. And in hindsight, after talking to my vet, I should have milked her out a little bit, but I was afraid to mess with her udder.
Or lose the colostrum.
Right. I mean, my vet said I could milk it out and freeze it, but that sometimes doing that would trigger her to labor, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to do it that early.
See, I
And
would
so,
think that would be worse because now you're unplugged the teats.
well,
Usually
that's
better to leave 'em
exactly
plugged.
what I thought as well. But sure enough, when she lambed and she had quads, I milked it out just to get rid of the engorgement, and she was full blown double mastitis. Like there was nothing usable in that udder. And
Sometimes they actually get the mastitis when you dry them off. Like my ewes have a lot of milk, and so the ewes at the extension farm, we now don't wean until like 100 days because they're on pasture with their mothers.
Mhm.
And it's a lot easier on them than when we used to be on the star system and we would pull the lambs early and then they'd have those big udders. You'd have to keep them super clean. And then if they have a lot of multiples and you got all those lambs like budding their udders over the years, I find, by the time they're 8 or 9 years old, their udders are just beat up basically.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
so mastitis is very frustrating in sheep because you can't usually pinpoint where you got it from or when they got it because they're only lactating for that time when they got the lamb with them, and then usually you watch their udders go down, but you don't really. I sometimes think they get infected then, and then it shows up when they freshen again in the spring.
Right. That's exactly what happened. All right. Well, thank you. It sounds like there's not necessarily anything different to do.
No.
Thank you.
More of the same. Okay, Gabby.
All right, can you hear me good?
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna try to go through this fairly quickly so we can have time for questions after. I'm gonna just get rid of my video here. Okay. So like Betsy said earlier, with colostrum, the absorption capacity decreases over time significantly after 2 hours. So in order to go and have proper immune function for our lambs and kids, we want to try to get that colostrum in them as soon as possible. And with that, sorry, it's hard to advance this slide. Okay. So along with quality, we want to work with our quantity too of colostrum. They go hand in hand. So if you use a refractometer or a Brix reader, you want a 24% or higher for solids for colostrum for the first feeding. And I have a picture and a slide later on to show you what a refractometer looks like and the options for that. You can use, like Betsy said, a colostrum replacer. And I would suggest trying to go and do your research and find out which ones are higher quality. And these tend to be a little bit better to, I guess it's not always the best to use, but one of the positives would be it helps eliminate disease transfer versus using the mother's colostrum. And I forgot to mention before, you can pasteurize the colostrum and that will go and make it free of disease for the lambs and kids. And if you have a lower quality colostrum from lamb or doe, or sorry, ewe or doe, then you can go and use a replacement or use a donor colostrum. So for quantity, we want 1 ounce per 1 pound of body weight. So the example I have here is a 6-pound kid or lamb will receive 6 ounces of colostrum per feeding. We want to go and try to make that to about 3 feedings of colostrum over a longer period of time, like about a day or so. And this is going to go and help support the not the calves. I work with calves way too much. So if I say calves, my apologies, for the lamb or kids immunity. So when it comes to bottle feeding lambs and kids, we don't want to go and feed cow's milk or cow's milk replacer that is meant for calves. It's a different protein makeup and it's not as easily digested. So we should try to shoot for a species-specific milk replacer. However, goats can drink lamb milk replacer, but lambs cannot drink goat milk replacer. And the reason for that is because of the copper that's in the goat milk replacer, and also the differences in protein and fat content, since lambs need a higher fat percentage than goats. However, there are also Capri ovary products that have a lower amount of copper in them and more of a middle of the road type protein and fat. So there are products like that available. Milk replacer is pasteurized, so that helps with the biosecurity issue with disease. And for options of acidification, there's partially or fully acidified milk replacers. So this kind of deters bacterial growth when it comes to free choice feeding. So we can have it sitting out in a feeder for a little bit longer and not have that bacteria grow as rapidly as it would without it being acidified. But it also helps enhance the gut health and digestion. And I've also seen it, it helps prevent overeating. So that will help with our bloat and our flare-ups of Clostridium. And then also milk replacers, you can get it that contain Decox, and this helps prevent against coccidiosis. So when it comes to mixing milk replacer, I'm not going to go through all of this step by step just for time's sake, but we want to go in, I would say first thing is we want to go and follow the bag's instructions for milk replacer because everyone is different and unique. However, for the most part, when it comes to mixing the milk replacer, we want a temperature of 110 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And anything higher than 140 will denature the proteins. It's pretty much just going to cook, and that's not going to be able to go and be as easily digested or available to be digested. And then less than 110, when it comes to mixing, you're going to have a harder mixing time, and you'll possibly have more clumps since that fat is not fully broken up. So as we go down through the steps, you want to keep in mind in the winter months or in the months that are a lot colder, we want to go and make sure that we're having the powder stored in a cooler location. However, we don't want it to be, outside in the shed because a cold powder will reduce that temperature for when it comes to mixing it. And you want to feed it at less than 105 to prevent burning. And like Betsy said, you can use a drill, a whisk to go and mix everything. So when it comes to milk nutrition, the percent solids that we want to shoot for within less than 2 weeks or during our very cold conditions would be 18 to 20%. I would say 18 is definitely the most common and probably recommended. That way you're not feeding possibly too high of solids if you're not mixing your milk replacer and water correctly. So you can lower it to 15% as the intakes increase and the lambs and kids get older. So the example we have down below kind of just shows, here, I'll get my pointer out, kind of shows here what percent solids would look like with how much milk replacer in ounces that we are putting into water. And so when I say into water, we're not measuring out a quart and we're not dumping the milk replacer on top because we're going to have a higher volume and less solids. So we could essentially be almost underfeeding our lambs and kids by doing this. So that's just something to keep in mind. For volumes, we want 1 ounce per pound of body weight. That still applies. However, our exceptions are for our auto feeders and our mob feeders. And we can increase with body weight as the animal grows. And I have a chart coming up that will go and show that. For frequency, we want to feed around 3+ times per day, and this will be where we see the best performance and the least amount of illness. And this mimics their natural behavior as much as possible, as if they are nursing with mom. So here's a chart to kind of go over what I was talking about with our solids. So, and how we can adjust accordingly to go and still meet our percent solids that are needed. So, you know, for example, if we have a 10-pound kid weight and we're feeding 10 ounces per feeding, this is 3 times a day feeding. That's going to get us to our 18% solids. So our total pounds per solids per day would be 0.34 pounds a day that of solids that they will be receiving. Oops. Trying to get rid of my laser pointer. There. So, like I mentioned before with the refractometer, we have the options of a digital and optical. The optical one, which is the one on top, this one in specifics is one that honestly you can get from Amazon for $18, and it works pretty decent for being, you know, $18. However, we have ones down here like the digital ones, and this is well over, you know, $200 to $300. And however, it's a little bit easier to use. If you have a larger operation, this could make more sense to go and do that. To go and figure out the solids though for milk replacer, there's some math involved using these. So you're better off following the tag instructions and making sure like your solids are correct. However, it's just a little bit more complicated with the math being involved, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. So if this is something that there is a question on, it could definitely go and help you out. But we're pretty much going to be following the
Gabby?
same. Yep.
Good. So how do those work? Do you put a drop of milk replacer on them somewhere and shine a light through it?
Yeah. So let me get my pointer. So kind of talking about for 1 second, the math, it's the same math that is right here. Okay. So you would go and place a drop of colostrum or your milk replacer if you were let's just go with colostrum first. So you'd place a thing of colostrum on here. You'd go and look through this end as you go and close that down, and that will go in, have light shining through on the other end to go and line up what it is reading. Where this you
Okay.
place just one drop, close it, press the button, go, and your Brix reading is right there.
Okay, thanks.
So it's fairly simple. However, milk replacer is different than colostrum, and you have to go and do a little bit more math to the readings that it's giving than just colostrum, where the Brix reading is the Brix reading. So for auto feeders, I worked very much involved and closely with calf auto feeders for quite some time. So I'm more well versed in that than I am with the lamb and kid auto feeders. However, these are much more simplified versions of our like Forster Technic, Laley's, DeLaval's, all those calf feeders. It's the most efficient way to grow lambs as quickly as possible since they are able to drink more frequently. However, depending on the size of your operation, it can be cost effective because you can save on labor costs, or you can have increased gains. However, there's the cost associated of setting up the machines, which are honestly fairly, I would say, inexpensive compared to calf feeders. And I would say even more so now, they're more inexpensive because I know the pricing for calf feeders have gone down. So I'm assuming the lamb and kid feeders have also gone down as well.
Gabby, I just looked at one this afternoon, quick from Premier, because I was looking at something else, and it was about $2,000, which sounded like a lot, except it said it could feed 120 lambs. So
yeah. So
that's a lot of lambs.
I know these ones, like I have the links here, that when we send out the presentations, you guys can go and click on and check out the videos. But I by no means have no preference to the Forester Technic ones. However, I just, like I said, I'm more well versed with the calf ones. So these are ones that I know are really reliable machines, and they do a good job. And I know they said that it would feed up to 220 lambs or kids with 8 stations per feeder, I think. It had the heating capacity to do that. So, but like I said, it's all in the brochure and the links and the videos too. But costs associated with that would be increased milk replacer usage, which, how much, it depends. I don't think it's honestly that much more since they're on free, or since they can go and drink more frequently. However, you're getting the gains associated with that, but you also have the cost of the auto feeder itself and then the maintenance. So with the auto feeders, we have adjustable portion sizes, so we can go in, adjust how much the lambs and kids are going to be able to consume. We can set the mixing, feeding, or it has a set mixing and feeding water temperature. So that's fairly consistent and it doesn't vary, and it's a perfect meal blended in each portion to be consumed. There's a semi-automatic cleaning that we can go and set up. And yeah, so here's where it feeds around 220 lambs, kids simultaneously at 8 feeding stations per feeder. So like I said, if you have a big operation, it would maybe make sense to go in to have that. So for nutrition, we want a high quality pellet where we don't have any fines. We can start giving kids small amounts within the first week. However, we want to go and make sure that they're actually going to eat it. You don't want to waste your money, and they might not have the desire to really go and pick at it. So it's going to be closer to weaning is where they're going to intake on grain intake, or they're going to increase, on grain intake, and where don't know where I was going with that. But yeah, they're going to increase on grain intake closer to weaning because we're going to decrease on our milk intake is what I wanted to say. So we can change the starter and maintain freshness. Sometimes this is just as simple as stirring it around. Like I said, try to go and start off with smaller amounts. If they keep cleaning that up, then by all means keep giving more. And they should hit about 0.5 pounds per kid per day before weaning. So starter intake and water consumption go hand in hand. Having 24/7 access to fresh, clean water is really, really important. When I was managing calves, we cleaned the water feeders every day, and I would clean it out or hit the plug, go and let the water drain out, spray it with a chlorine solution and scrub it with a brush, and then it'd go and fill back up, and I'd plug the plug back in, and fill back up with water, and I'd have the calves standing right there, all huddled, waiting to go and drink at the water because they really, really like the taste of fresh, clean water. And that will correlate with having higher grain intake. So just for some specs, 1 pound of starter equals about 4 pounds of water intake, and warmer water is preferred. So for weaning, there's a 8-week milk feeding period. So we want to start weaning kids at least, a week or 2 before weaning. Some methods of weaning would be dilution of the milk. So this is a gradual step down with powder to water ratio, where we're decreasing the powder, increasing the water. So we're ultimately decreasing the total solids within the milk. Reducing the number of feedings per day. For if we're feeding in the mob feeders, only allowing access to nipples for 50% of the day. However, this could lead to higher risk of overeating and bloating, since they're going to be essentially slug feeding during those times. And for the auto feeders, we can use the valves to go and shut off the lines. But like I said, it's still we could still have those problems with overeating. So some other tips would be maybe feeding electrolytes in the water during and after weaning. This kind of helps kind of calm everything and like get them a little less stressed. It gives them a little extra boost of energy. But we don't ever want to compound stressors at weaning. So our examples of that would be like dehorning or vaccinating or moving all at the same time of weaning, because we're going to have a negative feed intake with our grain especially. And then after weaning, we're going to have a harder time to go and get back to the gains that we worked so hard to get. And it's not recommended to go and move lambs or kids until about 2 weeks after weaning. Like I said, so they don't have that stressing period and they don't go and have that negative intake period. So in summary, lambs and kids need a higher level of colostrum and environmental temperature to thrive. Sanitation is really, really important, and prevention is key. So if you can go and make sure that you're doing your best to go and be proactive in cleaning, then that's going to lead to less health issues. Oh, sorry, 1 second. You can prevent Clostridium bloat as much as possible with vaccinations, a good quality milk replacer when it comes to mixing, temperature, and feed amounts. And like Betsy said, we need to treat them like the infants they truly are. They're like little babies. So we got to make sure we be patient and we give them a lot of care and attention.
So Gabby, we mentioned vaccinating there. I assume that would be like CDT. And ideally you'd give it to the mothers ahead of time so that when they get it in the colostrum, because they can't really, you could vaccinate them at birth, but it won't really have a lot of effect.
Right, yeah.
They need to be a couple weeks old, but it is important.
Yeah.
I'm curious if we have anybody on the call who's using a automatic feeder.
Oh, and I did want to mention, I do have, if anyone is interested, I do have more information and contact for who carries them in the US. I know the closest place is in Auburn, New York. So that's like 2 hours west from here. So I can get you in connection with that. And I do know they they sell them. They have some in stock already because I called and asked. And they also do repairs too and maintenance, which is really important because there's hardly anyone that does maintenance for the calves. That's why I had to know so much about them. But yeah, any questions? I'm sorry, I kind of ran through that really fast, but I want to make sure we had time for questions.
Those must have a thermostat on them so that they heat them water. The water comes in and it warms it right in the
It's a
feeder.
a boiler they have installed internally.
Cool. The only place I've seen, well, actually in Europe, I was traveling around France, and even in a few bottle lambs, they use a really cute little, looks like a coffee maker, like a giant coffee maker that makes that fed their bottle lambs. They don't do anything by hand that way. Another place I've seen them is on a really big farm out in Western New York, Matt Kyle's place.
Yeah.
Like 5,000 ewes, so he has quite a few bottle lambs, and he has like tubing strung all over. It's kind of crazy. There's a new message here. Hold on. If I can get my scroll down here.
Do you recommend
Go ahead. Go ahead, Gabby, you can read it.
Okay. Do you recommend cooling off milk temperature at a certain age or keep it warm right through until weaning? I know my answer, but I know sometimes it's not always practical. I mean, I would always feed my calves warm milk, so to me it seems crazy to go and feed cold milk for lambs and kids, but when it's in a mob feeder or something like that, it's going to eventually probably cool down if they're not drinking it as fast as possible.
Right.
So I would still, feed it starting off warm. If it turns colder, then it's not the end of the world. But you just want to make sure it gets warm enough to go and break down the fat globules and they can go and digest it as easily as possible.
I do know at Cornell they feed all cold milk replacer, even to the new lambs. But they don't have lambs that were in trouble. They just have lambs that they took away because they're milking the ewes after they've had colostrum.
Yeah, I think it's just based on preference, I guess. I just would feel too bad to do it.
It does seem like when it's cold out that it'd be nice to not feed them ice cold milk replacer. And they do shiver, like the ones at Cornell, you'll see them, they shiver and they go stand under the heat lamp. So it doesn't hurt them. They seem to grow really well, but
they're using energy to go and reheat their bodies when they can use that towards growth.
That's true.
But yeah, good question.
Other questions out there?
Like I said, you can unmute yourselves or you can put it in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Oh, we may have maxed out. An hour and a half on Zoom is about all anybody can take.
I know. Hopefully you're all not sleeping. Oh, do you ever have airlocks in the lines of milk machines? Are you talking about auto feeders or are you talking about actual, yes, auto feeders? Okay. No, I would say not because, well, so how these are is it's just like gravity flown up to the nipple, where the calf ones are a little bit more complex, where there's wall mounted pumps in addition to gravity flown ones. So, but like you shouldn't have any issues with the lines getting blocked with air. it might take like a few seconds for them to prime the milk out through the lines. But it's not gonna, there shouldn't be any issues after that.
I wondered about that too, because some of those lines are pretty long, so you have to,
Yeah.
you could hand milk it to the nipple too, I suppose.
Yeah. They sometimes, like in the beginning, they get a little impatient, but they'll get the hang of it pretty quickly. Yeah, but I haven't heard anyone have that issue.
So Gabby, there were a few people
Uh,
that came in after we started, so this is being recorded. So we will probably
Hang
send
on.
the recording out to people, right?
Yes. There's also another question. I had some nipples lambs would push air into the lines rather than draw up milk. Huh. So yeah, that sounds like more of the nipple issue rather than the lines. But I know like they make for those auto feeders specific nipples to go for those lines, so you shouldn't have that backflow.
They also, I noticed that the Premier one has like little anti-backup valves that go on there.
Yeah.
That might help too.
I think also though the positioning of where the nipple is would help from that happening. Like whether it be taller up on the wall or lower. I'm assuming the lower, then the less possibility for air, but. Any other questions? Like Betsy said, it's going to be recorded, and I'll send out I just realized we never sent out a reminder email. And we had honestly like everyone attend. We had 22 people.
We have a very dedicated audience tonight. That's great.
Yeah, that never happens. But I'll send up a follow-up email, and that'll have the link and then a PDF of the presentations we can send to.
I'll have to
For
get
the
mine
link for
too.
the video on demand that you all can rewatch the presentation.
Yeah, that way if you miss the beginning, you can catch the first part. Great. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. We appreciate it. Remember, if you have questions, you can always give Gabby or I a call also, or an email at our office. We'd be happy to talk with you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
If anybody needs experience lambing, we'll be lambing towards the end of April at the Extension Farm. If you're near Canton, you want to come out and get some hands-on lambing experience, just let me know. And we will be having goats, but I don't think they're coming till June. Okie dokie. Well, everybody have a great night, and it was great to talk with you all.
Thank you.
Good night, Gabby.
Good night, Betsy.